Dividing complex numbers is going to look very similar to rationalizing denominators when the denominator has two terms. And just as we talked about conjugates at that time, conjugate here is defined the same way. The conjugate of a plus bi is just a minus bi, and vice versa. You're just changing the sign in between the real and imaginary parts. And to divide two complex numbers, you're just going to multiply both the top and the bottom by the conjugate of that denominator. So we have 3 minus I. The conjugate of that is 3 plus I. So we're going to multiply both the top and the bottom by 3 plus I. So on top, I'll have 2 times the quantity of 3 plus I. And then on the bottom, we have binomial times binomial, which means we need to FOIL. First times first is 9. Outer gives us plus 3i. Inner gives us a negative 3i. And last times last gives us a negative I squared. And notice the 3i minus 3i are going to go away. Just as before, when we were rationalizing denominators, the whole point of multiplying by the conjugate is because it gets rid of that imaginary number. Remember, this I squared is actually equal to negative 1. So on the bottom, we have 9 minus a negative 1, or 9 plus 1, which gives us a nice whole number of 10 for the denominator. And then we have the 2 times 3 plus I on top, which means we can reduce the 2 and the 10 into a 1 and a 5. So at this point, we're looking at 3 plus I over 5. Now, the only other thing that we need to do with this, a lot of times your directions will say something like, write your answer in the form a plus bi. And what that's saying is it wants you to separate out the real parts and the imaginary parts. So instead of leaving the 5 underneath both of these terms, we want to put a 5 underneath each one individually. So that's going to give us 3 over 5 plus 1 over 5 times I. And this makes it easier to recognize that the real part of this number is 3/5 and the imaginary part of this number is 1/5 I. So this would be our final answer. Here we have a denominator of 2 plus I, so the conjugate would be 2 minus I, which we're going to multiply both the top and the bottom by. But now in this case, we have a binomial in the numerator, so we're going to have to FOIL these two together. So we'll have first times first is 2. Outer is minus 1i. Inner will give us minus 2i. And negative I times negative I gives us a positive I squared. And then we also need to FOIL on the bottom. 2 times 2 is 4. But then remember, we said since we're multiplying by the conjugate, the outer and inner are going to cancel out. So we can just do last times last, which gives us a negative I squared. And then each of these I squareds we're going to replace with a negative 1. Which means we actually have 2 minus 1, or 1, in the numerator, and then negative I minus 2i gives us a negative 3i, and then we have 4 minus a negative 1, or 4 plus 1, in the denominator, so 5. And then just as we did with the first example, we're just going to split it apart so that we can see that the real part is 1/5, and the imaginary part is negative 3/5 I.